For those just coming in, we're just giving everyone a little moment. We've got a good number of audience with us today. Jane and Thea and Tessie, Christian, lots and lots of people coming on now. We just give everyone time to come in. It always takes a few minutes for everyone to come through the portal. Lovely to see. South Leicestershire, Roger, welcome. Mary from Chiltington, welcome. Just give it another couple of minutes. You can see that the counter is still rising. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, let's make a start. So thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Sarah Long and I'm Chief Executive of the Tree Council, the national charity that brings everyone together for the love of trees. And it's a very special year for the Tree Council this year because it's our 50th anniversary. We were launched in 1973 when Dutch elm disease swept across the land, and the Tree Council was asked to help replant with the campaign Plant a Tree in 73. And this year for our 50th anniversary, we actually changed that slogan slightly and we changed it to Grow a Tree in 23, with the emphasis much more on caring for trees and ensuring that they reach maturity. This current winter planting season is coming to an end. We had the spring equinox this week on Wednesday. I was out with the team at Gerrard's Cross with the community where we were planting a community orchard of apples and pears, and we created a fantastic sort of mossy dead hedge for small mammals and for birds. And even before we'd finished, the birds were swooping down and going for the moss for their nests. So it really felt that day on the spring equinox that the earth was coming back to life again and that the colour was bursting out everywhere. And that's why we're particularly thrilled today to have three extraordinary artists joining us today to talk about their work and their love of trees and nature. So welcome to Joe Webster, Suzanne Yupper, and Miwa Nagato Apthorpe. Before I hand over to them, I'm just going to give a very brief summary of what Trees Outside Woodland and Us, the project that they've been collaborating on, what it's all about. It's in partnership with Forest Research and Lestari. And it's kind of an odd term, Trees Outside Woodland, but all it means is it's those trees that are in our streets and parks and playgrounds, orchard trees, trees that punctuate our hedgerows, the copses and spinneys, not the big forests and woodlands. So that's the Trees Outside Woodland. And in fact, they make up about 1/5 of all the trees in Great Britain. But it's a real shame. Very often these small copses and spinneys and trees outside woodlands, they get forgotten. It seems very unfair because they're the ones that actually we probably encounter most in our daily lives. So Forest Research and Lestari, supported by DEFRA, wanted to find out more about what these trees outside woodland actually mean to people. What influence do they have on our daily lives? We know lots about the environmental and economic value of trees, but what about their social and cultural value? So Forest Research and Lestari asked a selection of artists and writers to share their thoughts on this. Writers, artists, poets, storytellers, photographers, musicians, and more. And Joe, Suzanne, and Miwa, who are here today, are three of those artists. We'll put a link in the chat box so that you can see the wider project and exactly who's involved. So we're going to hear the personal accounts about our guest's relationship with trees, first from Joe, then Suzanne, and then Miwa. So one bit of housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions, please could you put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. We'll answer as many of them as we can at the end, but it just makes life a lot easier for us if you put them in the Q&A. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Joe Webster, who describes himself as a plein air painter who blends landscape with graffiti. He grew up in North Cornwall, studied at Falmouth College of Arts and then Nottingham Trent University, and his work is held in private collections in 13 countries across the globe. So Joe, over to you. We're going to turn our cameras off and leave you to present.
Hello, Sarah. First, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me and for being part of this project. It's been really interesting kind of having the opportunity to reflect on my work within this context. Yeah, so I describe myself as a plein air landscape graffiti artist. And by plein air, it means I work outdoors. And I kind of think maybe in another life I would have been an arborealist or a gardener or a fisherman or a farmer or something like that, because being outdoors is kind of the primary motivation of my work for my work. And for me, paint and using paintbrushes and color happens to be the vehicle to enable me to get outdoors, really. And so I count myself as being really, really lucky to have spent tens of thousands of hours over the last 20 years being sat in silence, just watching the natural world. It's a real joy and a real pleasure to have sort of be able to say that. And I've had encounters where kind of hares and deer and rodents and stuff have come up and spent quite a long time sort of in my presence, because generally when you encounter things outdoors, you're kind of stomping along on a coast path or something like that, and you scare animals away. But being sat in silence, watching the world, sometimes kind of I painted in Storm Eunice and 120-mile-an-hour winds, and I painted in sub-zero temperatures, and watching the world in those conditions kind of over such a long period of time, and it gives you a proximity and a different relationship and understanding with the world. So one of kind of the key sort of motifs or themes within my work that keeps coming back is this idea of permanence and mutability or ephemerality or something. And I capture that within the media that I work. So I use graffiti-based media, permanent markers and spray paints, because they dry very, very quickly on the canvas and they kind of act like anchors. And then I dilute my paint with different degrees of water and essentially allow the rain I paint in the rain and the mist and the hail and so on. And all of the different atmospheric conditions change the quality of the paint, and they create all these beautiful effects and textures on the canvas. And so the different media, the permanent and impermanent media that I use within my painting, I often relate it to the behavior of the natural world. So I think of it a little bit like a permanent marker is a little bit like a rock in a tide where the water is kind of blowing and washing and changing and continually kind of in flux around that fixed point. And it's the same with trees. So in winter, you see this fixed kind of skeleton, and then it creates this sort of sense of this mutability as the leaves kind of grow and they flutter in the wind and they change color and they disappear. You have this standing skeleton that's kind of there permanently. And these are two videos here are kind of sort of illustrating my process, and how, particularly with the first one, you might have seen kind of I sprayed lots of water on it and the paint is sort of running off the canvas as I paint. And so this and it's fascinating to think of a tree over a whole year's season, in the sense of kind of a standing sort of solid figure that's maybe very slowly growing limbs over yearly cycles, but this sort of this fluctuating change of leaves that kind of very, very rarely stands still in amongst all of it. And another thing that kind of came out of this research project that was really interesting is I paint, because I paint outdoors, I paint everything that I kind of encounter as I step outside my front door. So I have painted mountain ranges and deserts and stuff on international travels, but mostly I tend to paint quite often paint the coastline around here. But trees are one of the recurring things because they're ubiquitous internationally. So whereas I might paint like a really familiar kind of view that somebody may sort of recognize or been on holiday there or something like that, the trees are kind of very, very personal to us, in the sense that we all maybe even have one in our garden, or certainly have one on the road outside our house or in the park or something. And so I think more than any other landscape, which is maybe localized, trees are kind of a universal sort of symbol. And this piece here, this slide currently on the screen, represents some of kind of maybe almost the esoteric sort of value that I sort of in this piece was painted in 2016, and it was kind of my sort of thoughts and feelings about trees. So this piece, which was documented in the research, was centered around this idea of kind of these figures that we all have a relationship with a tree, and I was quoted in the thing about maybe we have a tree cousin or a doppelganger or something like that that we maybe go and sit under, or that we identify with, that we have almost like a family member, and maybe you grieve it when if it's dies, or if it has to be chopped down. And this tree here, I used blue and pink colors within the bark, particularly kind of towards the bottom. And I was starting to think this use of blue and pink, I was thinking about oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and the networks being almost like a sense of Gaia, you know, when you look at kind of river deltas and stuff. And within trees, this branching system visually reminds me of, with the branches above ground and the roots below, like kind of the bronchia in your lungs and so on. So there's this kind of this real sort of visual similarity, this relationship that we each have with trees in terms of the branching networks, in terms of kind of this oxygenation, deoxygenation. There's a sort of a partnership between, we respire carbon dioxide, trees photosynthesize, take them in, and breathe out carbon dioxide. So there's kind of like this breathing cycle that happens between us. But also as a landscape painter, most of the landscape is flat, it's horizontal, and you get cliff formations on coasts and sort of rocks, but very often it's trees that break the linearity. And so there's pieces where I've kind of, my work is describing standing figures. They're almost like human statues in the landscape, if you think of them sort of visually, and the way that they populate this horizontal field, if you like. And this piece here is more of a recent piece of mine. I've started combining graffiti into what my earlier paintings was very traditional, and there's always been a basis, a connection, deep sort of intimate connection with nature and water, sort of the cycles of life and stuff. But it felt quite naive in the context of the pollution and kind of our relationship with the planet and the way that we're behaving. This is a large sort of street art piece. It's 2.5 meters in dimensions there, and I've started tagging and putting graffiti into my pieces to kind of represent almost like the sense that that there's permanence and impermanence. Again, we are leaving all of this plastic throughout the world, and this sense of kind of what is lasting, what, like the tree skeleton, and what is kind of coming and going and being left, and how we need to kind of change our consumption and pollution patterns so that they're actually they're digestible amongst nature, if you like, and that they can be absorbed back into the cycles, rather than things that are kind of lasting, that are traces, and that are kind of like the marks and sort of this visual representation of the world around us. This piece called Tag Trees, you can kind of see there's a great relationship here between the video and the image. So I tagged a piece of cardboard, and then I've painted essentially the gaps between the trees, as in the way that the light hits the surface of the water here. And it's this relationship again with trees in the world, and in the sense of the shadows that they leave, and this idea of what is mutable and what is permanent, stuff like that. One of the other things I wanted to very sort of briefly touch upon within my talk is that I constantly drawn to trees outside woodland, and sort of single or pairs of standing trees, much more than working in woodlands generally, because when you have a single individual tree, it's almost as if it's able to reach its full potential. So a tree within Woodlands is kind of it jostles for space within the canopy, and it's limited. You see the sort of way that they grow is determined by the trees and the shapes around them, whereas a single tree kind of just is allowed to kind of reach its full potential and create the own shape of its own canopy. And within the shapes that I paint within the structures here, you can quite often, like oaks kind of are very sinewy, and the colors of the bark and just the shapes of the tree, and the angles that are represented visually, people can very often very quickly tell what species a particular thing is just by the shapes, and a single tree extends this, if you like. It really kind of exhibits and behaves in the unique way of its species, and yet it is shaped by the world around us. So often when you see trees that are in areas with high winds, they're kind of all blown sideways, and so even though it's allowed to reach its full potential, it's kind of been shaped by the environment. And that might happen by wind, but it's also kind of if there's a wall or a constraint, or if the size of the space in which it's growing in, that can happen as well. And also, again, this relationship with man. So it comes back to things I touched on with the graffiti there and so on. And another thing I'm fascinated by is kind of and repulsed by as well, like I don't want to just kind of paint this sort of utopian, pristine idea of nature. I really want to grapple with this idea of kind of the destructive element that we potentially have, or we do have on the planet. And so I'm kind of fascinated by graffiti sometimes in bark, and man's kind of almost impulse and need to leave his or her presence on the world. We have to kind of leave this kind of permanent mark on the world. And so talking about how this unique sort of form that has reached its full potential is then sort of shaped by the wind. Trees are also shaped by man. And so you get these amazing things. I've sort of sat on a double-decker bus, and you get this tree that's going straight up, and then suddenly when it's reached the limit of kind of the buses or lorries on the road, suddenly the tree does a right angle, and it has this amazing kind of square cut out of the face of it. And here with kind of the high hedgerows in Devon, you quite often get these coppice trees that are shaped by the nature of the farm machinery that's kind of splaying the hedges and just sort of thrashing them down. And you also get trees that are kind of shaped through farming. So I lived in the Algarve in Portugal for a couple of years, and there were this trio of, they were almost like ancient matriarchs of the village in which I lived in, where this trio of olive trees must have been over 1,000 years old. And I could see in the landscape around me that if an olive self-seeds, it becomes very much like hazel or blackthorn or something. It throws out thousands of really tiny sort of wiry things, and it becomes sort of spindly and sharp little squat bushes. And it's through man's interaction and sculpting and this generational kind of relationship with olive trees, where you chop everything back except for one stem, and then it just turns into a big bush on the top of that, and you chop all of that back into kind of a lump, essentially, over potentially 10 plus generations. These trees have been shaped into these huge things where it would have taken maybe 2 or 3 people's span to sort of circle around the base of these incredible kind of standing figures that kind of, I just remember being just marveling at what they must have seen, and the shape of them and their resemblance, and today they've lasted for as long as they have because of very careful sculpting and farming through successive generations in order to produce fruit, and yet they've benefited as a result of it as well. So humans kind of have this sort of this really positive, kind of caring, constructive, conservationist kind of approach towards nature. And yet there's this kind of careless disregard that it's important not to kind of, it's really tempting to put your fingers in your ears, bury your head in the sand and ignore this kind of this sense of humans' behavior towards nature. But Sarah, you popped back on.
Oh, thank you, Joe. There is such joy in your work and such vibrancy in your colours. It's been such a treat to not only see the pictures, but to learn a bit more about your techniques and processes as you work as a plein air artist, but also your interest in how you know, the contrasts of nature and how humans have had their influence on it. So thank you very, very much for that. And I mean that sort of contrast of joy and human challenge is something that our next artist, Suzanne Yupper, also feels very strongly about too. I'm going to ask Suzanne to come. She is a photographer, a poet, conservationist. Suzanne grew up in the States, but now lives and works in mid Wales. Hugely multi-talented. She's writer in residence at Climate Cymru, an award-winning poet, a rare species conservationist, a social entrepreneur, and she has studied humpback whales and bats and presents with the BBC Natural History Unit. So, Suzanne, I'm going to hand over to you to tell us a little bit more about your life and work.
Oh, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Joe. That's, so fascinating being inspired by the trees, and not just in the UK, but in different parts of the world as well. You can hear that I'm American. I was actually raised on the border of Canada and the States in Ontario. And I spent time in Tennessee as well, where Dolly Parton's from, before moving to the UK to study in the 80s. And I studied English. I've always written poems and short stories, but I also studied countryside management. And my first job was as a forestry officer on Merseyside. So I've always had a very deep connection with trees. And I've appreciated different community groups' connections with trees as well. I found it very inspiring to work with community groups in the Northwest and in Wales to preserve habitats and preserve trees. I'm going to share a poem that was just published recently in a magazine called Modron. It's a Welsh magazine that is bringing attention to the ecological and nature emergency. And I'm going to introduce the title, which is The Marriage Tree. And I think, the marriage trees are two trees, you don't have to be the same species, that grow together. And it might be because they were in a hedge, or it might be that they were conjoined through natural forces, as Joe has described. But I'm just going to share this with you, and then you can see what you think. The poem starts with an epigraph. Anosculation is a natural phenomenon in which trunks, branches, or roots of two trees grow together. Reference, Blackthorn, Prunus spinosa. When we were first young and guarded, we competed in minute whispers. Always the joker, you knocking my shoulder, I tried to play straight. Unbrowsable, our midriffs grew thick, then bolted, depending on the weather. Till one spring, my spinnowing veils drew smiles in the wet and chill. Well-wishers looking for bloom on skin, even if it drew blood. Sweetness in cold times, when all is said and done. A cloying memory after drawing any poison. Gale forces to make us forget. Our clothes discarded at our feet. How did we come to share the same shape? Nightly, our skins rubbed together till we became shameless, knots dissolving, cambric fabric of our limbs unpicking, moving yet resisting, xylem stitching to a crust. Now, your arms are my air, and our many years of consensus back each other and back each other, our obvious bad points facing out, impenetrable, mattock grubbed, gossip thwacked, bomb proof. Astringent words drying in their mouths on catching sight of your dark eyes, or strong, blunt fingers still supporting me, pleatured at the wrist. So that's a poem that you can read at Modron magazine. And indeed, if you wanted to read any more of my work, you'll find quite a lot of it on the internet in different magazines and even in the National Poetry Library. So I've worked for 20 years in conservation. I've worked with some really rare species, including the pine marten here in mid Wales. And I've always been inspired by writing about trees. And I used to hide in trees as a child. I think a lot of us have the experience of actually getting up into trees when we're learning to climb and thinking that no one could see us, that we were invisible. And I've spent a lot of time tree planting with communities, making new hedgerows, creating buffer zones along rivers, habitats for otters, and actually protecting trees that are threatened by sort of progress. And I wanted to draw your attention to a campaign about some trees just over the border from mid Wales into Shropshire. The poetry community in the UK is actually quite focused on climate mitigation and raising issues of climate adaptation through our work. And a beautiful poet from Montgomery named Jen Hawkins actually raised the campaign to save the Darwin oak in Shrewsbury with us at a meeting where we were sharing our poetry a couple of weeks ago. I had heard about the campaign. The Darwin oak is a veteran tree. It's 550 years old. It's actually in the north of Shrewsbury. And you know, Charles Darwin is one of Shrewsbury's most famous sons. It's the place where he used to play as a child. And there's about 9 or 10 veteran trees there, very mature trees. They might not be ancient, but they're so mature, they're of great biological and ecological value. They're irreplaceable in the landscape. And it's being threatened by a new road development that's happening in the north of Shrewsbury, a bypass. Now, people that myself, who are conservationists, community groups who know the local area, the town council there, we all have studied climate mitigation now for quite a few years. And we know that the answer to a lot of our problems is, you know, sort of reducing consumption, as Joe's mentioned, and that includes car use, and that a new road probably isn't going to save emissions, and it's certainly not going to save money, but it also, you know, dismantle permanently our ecosystems on which we depend. So if you get rid of veteran trees, they're not going to come back. If you get rid of peat bogs, you know, they're not coming back. So what we need to do is support campaigns like this. The Woodland Trust has an event tomorrow to bring attention to the Darwin Oak campaign. And if you type into the chat, Save the Darwin Oak, Woodland Trust, you'll see the event come up. You can access the event by going over to Shrewsbury, going to the park and ride, and getting off at a pub. Everybody's going to have fun at the pub, walk out to the oak, and then there's going to be an attempt at a record-breaking event. Thousands of people dressed up like Charles Darwin, which I think is a really great imaginative idea. And that's one of the reasons why we need trees. They capture our imagination. They actually show us what natural growth, instead of accelerated growth, can achieve, natural cycles. We can research trees and their networks to find out how we need to adapt in the future. Discontinuity is already happening, and we know and feel that with extreme weather events. We need to study things like how veteran trees adapt in our landscape, how trees around them adapt to changing weather conditions, what understory comes through, and actually apply those lessons to our own communities and our own spatial awareness, and how we express ourselves creatively through that. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Suzanne. That really is the most beautiful poem, so evocative. And I could see lots of hearts. I don't know whether you, because you were reading, there were lots of hearts that were kind of floating across the screen. So I think that everybody in the audience was absolutely loving it as well. And it's great for us to see some of our hedgerow species celebrated in this way, blackthorn and hawthorn, as well as the kind of more imposing trees. And I'm going to see if Team Tree Council can just put a link to National Hedgerow Week, which is coming up. They'll put a link in the chat for people to enjoy. Really important to hear about that campaign for the Darwin oak. Those trees, as you say, are irreplaceable. They play such an important part in our communities and in our hearts, as we've discovered recently. So thank you again. And now I am delighted to introduce Miwa, who's going to come on camera. Are you there, Miwa? Just give Miwa time to join us. Miwa Nagato Apthorpe, who is another of our very multi-talented practitioners.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. We can see and hear you. Hi, Miwa, and welcome. So Miwa is a British-Japanese musician, silversmith and artist living on the Scottish borders. She's particularly interested in folk tradition and how we share stories, and her work explores the aspects of history, climate, and womanhood, and the multicultural aspects of that, with a very strong streak of personal performance. So, Miwa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. I have to say I feel just really honored to be here, especially following on from Suzanne and Joe. I've taken so many notes from what you both said and feel really inspired by your work, and definitely feel some themes that I really resonate with. So thank you so much for having me. I'll just introduce myself and say a little bit about kind of who I am and what I do. So as Sarah said, I'm an artist, silversmith, and musician living and working in the Scottish borders. But hearing what Joe was saying about feeling very inspired by nature and having the opportunity to sit with nature, sit and paint trees in silence, it made me think about the fact that I think, although I'm an artist and a silversmith as well, I think a singer is the thing that I really am. So it's my most natural way of interacting with my environment, if that makes sense. And I was very lucky to be raised out in the middle of nowhere in the countryside, where I spent a lot of time, I guess, kind of communing with nature now that I look back on it as an adult. But I was sort of just allowed to run free in the wilderness, spent a lot of time with trees and with nature. And that's kind of where I started my journey as a musician, not necessarily performing for audiences, but just singing for the pure joy of it. And I guess a lot of the time the audiences were sort of trees and fields and things like that. So yeah, that's who I am and what I do. And over the past maybe 4 years, I've been focusing more on songwriting craft. I was really lucky in 2022 to have the opportunity to be musician in residence with a local arts organisation in the Scottish Borders, who invited me to come and write music as part of a project which had a few focuses of ecology, food growing, nature, and local histories. So for that project, I wrote 2 pieces of music, and one of them is the Hawthorne song, which you should be able to see on screen right now. The lyrics are on the right. And I might talk a little bit about the way that the idea for this song was conceived, because it was written in a way where the kind of process of writing it was a large part of what the song came to be. So I wanted to, being a folk musician and being interested in folk music and the way that stories are told and shared, I wanted to write something which would basically be an experiment in what we called fast forwarded oral tradition. So I'm fascinated by the way that folk tunes kind of become what they are by being shared, and they take on different kind of colorings and adaptations and transmute and change as they're shared, and the fact that often the original writer is lost to history. So this song I wrote with the intention of it being quite simple in form so that it would be easy to teach. And then I taught it to a local singing group, which I'd established, and they taught it to another local musician who taught it to another local musician who taught it back to me. And by the time it made its way back to me, it had a new verse. So the third verse, many the noble, noble ones, was not a verse that I wrote, that had been added in. So it returned to me with a new verse, which is really interesting. And that verse specifically speaks quite a lot to the fact that there's a real history of clearance in the Scottish Borders, where landowners have removed people from their land within the last kind of 500 years. And we have an enormous amount of deforestation and lots of spruce plantations. So the person who wrote this verse was obviously talking, they plant my kin in lines, they made up in their minds to tell the land that it's no longer free. So in that context, the hawthorn or trees kind of become a way of demarking the land and creating kind of boundaries. But hawthorn, I chose hawthorn as the subject of this song because, firstly, the town I live in is called Hawick, and there's some speculation that Hawick itself as a name came from hawthorn. But I was interested in the hawthorn as a subject because it has a lot of relevance, not only culturally, but also kind of mythologically and magically. So hawthorns are often boundary markers in a physical sense in terms of dividing up fields. It's really common here in the Scottish Borders, where we have a lot of farmland, that you'll see hawthorn hedgerows dividing up farms. But also they act as, in the kind of magical, mythological world, they act as the boundary between this world and the next. There's this kind of eerie, spooky quality about hawthorn. And I developed a special relationship with a particular hawthorn tree, which is local to me, which sits just on the boundary between two halves of a local cemetery within a kind of very sparsely planted couple of row of trees, which it came to my attention because I noticed that there were lots of trees in there, like rowan and oak and hawthorn and elder, which I believe are sacred to the Druids. So it feels like a kind of magical place to be. And I would go and spend time with this particular hawthorn tree and found that it had a sort of lesson to teach me in every season. So the vibrancy and the vitality of the red berries in the autumn taught me something about, heart healing medicine, as it's often used in herbalism, and the green buds in the spring, kind of a sign of hope, and then the stunning white blooms, which we've had for the last couple of years, and really, really beautiful hawthorn blooms all over the borders. It felt as though in every season the hawthorn had something to offer to me. So I decided to place it at the center of this song, partly because I believe that, I'm trying to find a way to articulate this well. In traditional folk music, at least the kind of Scottish traditional folk music that I'm interested in, it's not hugely common that a piece of music will be written from the perspective of a non-human being. There's one other example I can think of, which is a song called The Twa Corbies, which is about two crows, which has a kind of eerie quality. And I think a lot about human relationships with nature. And I'm going to reference Robin Val Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about the fact that she's trying to learn the language that her grandfather was prevented from speaking, like his native language as an Indigenous American. She, as an adult, returns to try and learn that language, and she really, really struggles with the way that the language is structured, and until she discovers that when describing, I think in the book it's a bay, that this language is asking her to phrase that to be a bay or to be a river. And she has this kind of revelation where she realizes that you only refer to something as an object if you believe that it doesn't have a spirit. And that really stuck with me. So she kind of realizes that in her Indigenous culture, it's understood that water is a living thing that on one day might be being a bay and another day might be being the ocean or being a river. And I think a lot about the way that we tell stories and the way that we use language affects how we interact with the natural world. And so I decided to write a song from the perspective of a tree, with the hope that it will allow the listener to identify with the tree itself. I'm just aware that I don't know how much time I have left, so I'll just move quickly on to the fact that this song is one that was designed to be shared. So I would invite anybody who would like to, hopefully we'll hear it at the end of today's event, but if anybody would like to learn the song and add a verse or teach it to somebody else, please do. That would bring me so much joy if this song can travel further than Hoik.
Oh, thank you, Miwa. It was been just lovely learning more about, not only about hawthorn in general, but about your own particular hawthorn and the way that you actually enjoy people helping develop a particular song. Some people are quite precious about their work, but it's lovely to hear about that tradition. And as you said, we're going to play a recording at the end of this workshop webinar so that people can actually hear your song. So I'm going to ask all our artists now to put on their cameras so that we can see everybody, and we'll have a conversation and perhaps weave in some of the questions that are in the Q&A. And one question that I'm sure, I just wait for everybody to come back on screen if Suzanne is there as well. I think that one question I'm sure the audience would like to ask all of you is your reaction to this week's big art news story, Banksy's artwork in Hornsey in North London, with the pollarded cherry tree in front of the white wall, which had been spray painted with green. So I'm going to ask Jo first, as a graffiti artist yourself, what message or question do you think that he was trying to convey? Because it was like quite open-ended. And also because we've got a question in the Q&A, and I'll read it out. It's from May, and it says, for Jo, graffiti is typically associated with urban landscapes. How did you come to realize or experience that graffiti and nature were not mutually exclusive, that you were creating landscape graffiti that became part of your larger style of plein air art?
Well, there's a lot in that question. How many
Yeah, there's a
questions
lot
is
in there, but instant reaction. A, to Banksy, and B, to how you set off on graffiti with
there?
nature.
Miwa, Susan, I loved everything that you said. I've been writing down reams of notes and ideas as well, and yeah, thank you. My first reaction to that question, Sarah, is kind of this idea that urban and the wild or nature can be connected. I mean, if they're only not connected if we never leave our houses, but even if we sit inside our houses, we still consume things from the natural world, don't they? So it's how can they not be interconnected, actually, and kind of taking something that is synonymous with the city, with urban, and putting it in the world. Actually, it kind of unites this more holistic approach that we need to have to be able to somehow resolve our relationship with the world to survive, if you like, for want of like a different frame. Banksy's. I'm not going to act as an authority on sort of graffiti, because I think all art is just in the eye of the beholder. It's kind of anybody's thoughts or feelings about a reaction about something is as valid as anyone else's, really. I had a couple of conversations with people who went, "Oh, it's not very good, is it?" And I mean, my personal opinion, kind of Banksy's work is not necessarily the most sort of technically executed. They're not the most amazing kind of technically painted pieces. His work is about thoughts and concepts and provoking discussion. So it is quite interesting that he focused right here and now, and I wonder with the timing of it that he's drawing attention to the idea of trees in the city in the context of his discussion. And it's also interesting from my discussion about kind of the tree is a block, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
really basic tree form with the fluidity of paint.
I mean, I was quite interested with Mia was talking about, you were talking about how you love it when your songs change shape and so on. And I know that since the Banksy artwork has gone up, that people have added to it before the fence went up around it. So kind of your thoughts on all of you, maybe starting with Mira, about if somebody has done a graffiti on a wall, is it a good idea to add to it, or is it an artwork that should be left on its own?
I think it depends on the artwork. My personal feeling again on Banksy is that he's reached such a kind of status where anything that he does is worth enormous amounts of money. So is it devalued by people adding to it? I think more on the kind of folk art and community art level, then I think it's up to the artist if they invite people to add things. I think the fact that graffiti happens on in public spaces, so there's always a kind of risk. I don't personally think it's a bad thing to add to a Banksy artwork. If anything, I think maybe it's kind of cool to play with that, because Banksy is kind of traditionally anti-institution, but then has kind of become an institution in a way. Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, just coming on to Suzanne, you're using poetry to campaign for the Darwin Oak, and what's the special strength of poetry to capture people's imagination? And there is a question actually in the Q&A from Helen that sort of fits with that campaigning idea. What's been the most effective way to get your whole community involved in that campaign?
I think the thing about poetry is that it uses words as modules and put together in different ways to express what is the inexpressible. So a really good poem about a social problem that we face like the nature emergency, which, let's face it, can be very disempowering for a lot of us, and especially for young people coming up, I think. So a really good poem can capture the imagination, just like a standard tree in a field that's been there for hundreds of years and in different seasons. So I think it's about making icons, you know, it's about actually being involved with the making of things that capture the imagination and show us what the future could be like, and that our future is malleable and it does adapt. It doesn't have to be a certain way, and it doesn't have to be destructive. It can be restorative. Coming back to Banksy, I mean, what he's doing with his art, I believe, is he's making us question the values that we hold and the values that we place on things. And not that I think living objects are things. And I really love the idea that everything has a spirit and is sentient. And I think that's something that we realize as very small children. And then somehow, as we grow up, we get institutionalized by lots of different systems. So yeah, I thank Banksy for putting a little spoke in that wheel, a big spoke. Yeah.
I think that's one of the great, go on.
Sorry, the community, getting the community together. I think you need to think about the community's values and the shared values, and maybe even making up language that communicates those shared values together. So for this one, it is the love of nature up by this part of Shrewsbury, and the love of Shrewsbury's history as well with Charles Darwin. No matter what you think of Charles Darwin's science, he did have an impact. Thanks.
There's a really interesting. Sorry,
go on, Joe.
There's something really interesting about sort of a collaborative approach. So with street art, if you put something on a wall in a public place, I think by definition it's going to be defaced and painted over and collaborated. And Miwa, you're the same with kind of oral histories, inviting people to write new verses and change words. There's something really lovely in all of this discussion about collaboration, a community creating new words and stuff. And I think quite a lot about how to kind of to protest and stand up against the destruction of the Darwin Oak, but yet how to include people so that they care about it, rather than telling them to stop driving a car. They suddenly find that they actually want to because they care, and how to get that balance is.
I think the great power of whether it be music, poetry, or art is to make us look more closely at the things that we quite often forget about. And I think, Joe, you know, I think it's some of the things I've read, you've said, looking at the patterns in nature, the things we don't, and then that brings us closer and builds that incredible relationship that makes us care about the future. I mean, one of the things that the Tree Council's being commissioned recently to do a piece of work, to do some research on trees of social, cultural, historical value, and how can we protect them better after what happened at Sycamore Gap, that terrible tragedy. You know, what are either the legal penalties that should be imposed if somebody chops down a tree, but what are the incentives, what are the grants and so on that can be offered to people so that we can safeguard these really beautiful trees. I think we've just got time for one more question, actually, before we finish. There's one from Helen Muri, which is a very practical question, which says, what do you think is a good way to start trying to draw or paint a tree? And I guess that can apply to words as well, but maybe you could each just say, what do you think is a good way to start trying in your particular art form to describe trees? Go on, Joe, you go first.
Um, I guess for me, it's the trunk. It's you start at the ground up almost, and then you just maybe you divide the sort of the height of it up, and you look at where are the main forking shapes. Where does one divide into two, two into three and four, and so on, and you get the main structure sort of centrally, and then I do a very sort of rough outline of the crown and all of the filigree and the detail at the top. I get very expressive, and I don't try to get all of the detail perfect. So it goes somewhere from kind of really, really structured up to kind of sense of it as the theme.
Okay. Suzanne.
Yes, I would say smell the tree, listen to the tree, listen to the sounds the tree makes in different conditions, and feel the tree, touch the tree, taste the tree. The hawthorn, and those young leaves, we call them bread and cheese in this part of the world, because kids would pick them on the way to school and have a snack. All those different things, and learning about local stories as well might inspire you to do some writing or painting, and let those senses run together, let them influence each other.
Thank you. And Miwa.
I think, yeah, probably similar to what Susanna said. For me, it would be about forming a relationship with the tree itself, and also spending time around, for me personally, spending time around trees when I'm in a time of need and feeling supported by them, and having a kind of reciprocal relationship, offering something back, and feeling like developing a friendship, and then listening to hear if it has anything that it wants to say, need to be put into a song.
I think you're so right that that personal relationship is, I mean, we do quite a lot of work with schools, and we know that what's being called eco-anxiety is causing havoc in schools, where young people are being bombarded with the messages about climate change and biodiversity and so on, and they feel completely disempowered and that they can't make a difference in any way. But even as simple a thing as going out and planting a tree or looking after a tree, watering it, weeding it, can make you feel so much better, and that you are making a difference, even if it's quite a small one. So yeah, I want to say thank you to all three of you. You're all absolutely amazing, and it's been incredibly moving hearing about your art and about your personal relationships with the trees outside Woodlands. We always talk at the Tree Council about the trees outside Woodlands because that's the bit that we're focused on rather than the big forests. You've inspired us all to get closer, I think, to our own trees, and to explore our own individual responses to them. So thank you to DEFRA for funding this research, and for forest research and Lestari. Thanks to our wonderful audience who've been participating with us here today. Please look after the trees in your local neighbourhood. And also next week, we've got a webinar coming up called Healthy, Happy Trees. And you can see the time and date here, how to start your own little tree nursery, or even get involved in a community tree nursery. We'll leave that link in the chat so that you can pick up on it. So thank you to our audience from all the panelists. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you from Team Tree Council. I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend, and do just stay on, because you'll be able to hear a recording of Miwa's song just at the end of the webinar. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Many the bonny children have come. Many the bonny children, said she. They come to gather flowers in the evening hours, and for shade on a warm summer's day. Many the mournful, mournful ones have come. Many the mournful, mournful ones, said she. They're telling tales of loss, and though they know love's cost, they're happy just to have a place to cry. Many the cruel-hearted ones have come. Many the cruel-hearted ones, said she. They come with a wicked plan to cut me where I stand, and they never will be seen again. Many the wise, wise ones have come. Many the wise, wise ones, said she.